So first of all, thank you for the opportunity, Dr. Gorbani, and it's tough act to follow after listening to everybody sort of talk about cybersecurity and so on. So, as I reflect upon this morning and the early part of this afternoon, and some of the material that sort of I thought I would sort of cover, um, I'll just intersperse some of the conversations that we've had during the morning and the afternoon to make it a bit more connected, as opposed to repeat some of the stuff that's already been spoken about. Lots of times, what happens in sort of my career, um, and when I speak to sort of our executive team and our board and so on, is a conversation around the world and its volatility and all the things that are happening, and the opportunity or the problem of figuring out a way to relate them all. And it's important, I feel, for any sort of cybersecurity executive or anybody in this space to be able to relate them, because it provides a more complete perspective of how you would want to assess risks and so on. So the early part of this year, I mean, this year has been complicated and in so many different ways. But in the early part of this year, we had a conversation around, if there were 5 risks. I mean, five's probably the maximum number that a person could probably remember. And if there were 5, how would you organize all this volatility into 5 bullet points? And while it might not be completely exhaustive, but so far in the past 8 months, it's proven to be relatively useful. So I thought I'd anchor my conversation around that, and then we can sort of move around from there. So, we've seen there's political tensions. Um, we've got sovereignty, nationalist policies. Um, there's a lot of innovation, which is great in all sectors. We've got conflict, and we have a difficult economic social climate. So, from a security standpoint, it's a really difficult place to be, because in one way, you want to provide new digital services to your customers. Then you want to be able to also make money for your organizations, and you want to be able to protect your national borders and security, and so on and so on and so on, and put food on the table. So, with all those basic Maslow hierarchy problems, how do you make the case to understand the risks, and how do you make the case to make sure that there is sufficient investment in security is always an interesting conversation, because people will take the blue button before they go patch their systems. I tend to look at these risks in sort of the bucket of 5. One, potential threats because of trade and sovereignty arguments. I invented this, I built this, therefore, at some point, if I don't like you, I'm not going to give it to you. Those sorts of things. And then we'll sort of unpack each one of these as we go along, but I'll take you through the 5. Then there's data sovereignty and localization. We've got, so we're a global company and operate in 26 different markets. And we've got pressures from a localization standpoint. There's countries that say it's our citizens, our data. You can't send it anywhere else. You have to store it here. You have to process it here. People who see it and touch it need to be citizens of this country, and so on and so on and so on. And why it's important for us to sort of look at the direction of travel as it relates to data sovereignty and technology sovereignty in general. It's important for all of us to sort of consider. Then we have regulation. In some countries, they're doing away with regulation, I see, but we're not privy to such novel politics. Therefore, we have a lot of regulation and regulators are becoming a lot more prescriptive. There are a lot of good things that come from prescriptive regulation, but there's also a lot of pain that comes from prescriptive regulation, as people in regulated industries can subscribe to. Then we've got sharing reductions. So, we've been successful so far because we share. And this is threat information, this is incident information, this is a variety of this sort of stuff that allows us to effectively come together, collaborate, and be able to respond. If we stop sharing, we've got bigger problems to deal with because we independently cannot in any way, one, address all of this information and triage all of this information that's available, or two, focus on the right sorts of things. And lastly, which we spent a large portion of today around, there is the growth of AI that's leading to a lot of brand exploitation, which leads to a whole bunch of sort of fraud related things. And most interestingly, in this space, we see questions being asked by others, and we sort of think about it as well in sort of my role. At what point does misinformation allow you to manipulate the market? Because a large portion of sort of our investment advice and so on and so forth is based on news. And at some point, we're going to get to a capability that we're all going to need to have to determine what's real and what's not. And if we're starting to get influenced more by opinion and news that may not necessarily be real, are we going to end up making decisions that are not going to be right for us? And you can take that investment paradigm to a variety of different areas, but from our standpoint, that's something that it's important for us to look at because we're a large investment manager with a trillion plus dollars under management. So it is important for us to think about that problem. And it goes back to some of the research that we spoke about in terms of misinformation and so on and so forth. So when we look at the top 5 risks, these are usually I anchor most conversations on because any way you slice it, you can fit something new in here. If you talk about quantum, you could probably fit it into the last one with respect to emerging risks and so on. If you talk about not going to sort of intelligence and response and so on, you could fit it into number 4. Anything that has to do with new regulation to getting rid of old regulation, etc., you could fit it into 3. Um, People, social, um, economic, and sovereignty related conversations into 2. And our underlying plumbing for that we use in terms of tech, in terms of process, in terms of people, become our supply chain challenges. And it's very difficult to talk about a problem without addressing all of these issues as you look at things. And we've had situations where we would have a cybersecurity incident. Which maybe a better analysis would be when Russia decided to invade Ukraine. The week before, we decided to go through an analysis of our exposure in the region, financial, our sort of an analysis of all of the various threat actors that Russia would typically use based on our understanding of all the Russian threat actors, the way they would operate. Then we looked at our controls and we said, these sorts of things may not work, but here's some opportunities for us. And then went and had a conversation with respect to what sort of funding we're going to need to be able to go plug those holes. So just in case, they did decide to go spray Canada or whoever that decided to support Ukraine, we would end up in a situation where at least our controls worked. Then we looked at our supply chain in terms of where we get our tech, where we get our hardware, where we get our software and our people and so on. And we're still actually plunking through that mess. And we see that there are significant concentrations in different parts of the world. And and I think that's no different from any Canadian company. Like if you went and looked at your own supply chain, you probably are concentrated in a couple of two or three areas of the world, which introduces a whole bunch of concentration risk that you need to sort of think about and consider for the future. And I think some of the conversations we're starting to have with respect to technology sovereignty are great, but it is going to take us forever to get to a point where we can be self sufficient with respect to these sorts of technologies. I think a lot of people covered a lot of this. Um, we're, essentially, when we take a look at attacks, I try to simplify it in terms of how we would look at it. So we've got the state-sponsored ones, and that could be anything. It's largely to do with, um, uh, critical infrastructure or financial institutions or so on, or without attribution, be able to raise some money for your pet war or pet project. Credential theft is a big deal. We're also in the retirement business, and low barrier of entry in terms of credential theft, as Chris can attest to. And people can't remember passwords, store it on their browsers. There's info stealer, takes all of these things, and next thing you know, your parents have lost a couple of $100,000 from their retirement account, and they're mostly worried about their health and not monitoring their retirement account, and before you know it, it is gone. And I personally have seen so many instances of this sort of stuff happening. It's depressing. Usually we try to make people whole, but then how much are you going to hold in reserve to be able to, make all of these people whole? Because it adds up really quickly. AI driven fraud is a big deal. We're starting to see a lot of impersonation related things. In fact, our asset management business had some interesting experiences with impersonation, and they're getting very sophisticated and very, um, academically speaking, spectacular. Um, but unfortunately, we don't have technology that is well suited to identification of these sorts of things, and we don't have a framework for response either. And I think these are some of the things that if you sort of look at um, these various areas, I also don't feel that we don't do sufficient academic and industry collaboration around specific areas, because these are sort of things that require a little bit more than a bunch of smart people hanging out in a room and trying to get a solution in place. Like, you need some deep research to be done as well. And I think we fail to. I think we have the opportunity really to leverage our academic institutions to be able to work on these. Malicious bots. I mean, everything is a bot nowadays. In fact, my wife called me up the other day and she said somebody's trying to get into my Facebook and at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I was like, yeah, don't worry, no one cares about your Facebook. It's probably a bot. And but you do see things like this, right? And there's a significant increase in all of these types of issues or patterns of attacks, and I find it useful to sort of synthesize it into three or four things so that people can get their head around what's it really that we're looking at. So people end up asking the question, what is the likelihood of credential theft happening within our online ecosystem? Give them a view with respect to, yes, we got 900 properties. Of the 900 properties, I have 600 that are MFA. There's other 300 that are not. Need to MFA them, limits the amount of exposure. This is what you need to do investment wise, or this is what you need to do to get rid of the 300. So something like that, you see. In the next couple of slides, I wanted to just sort of double click into some of these areas, but I'm also open to having a conversation around page one in terms of the five risks and how we sort of think through those. When we look at, so what I thought I'd do was talk a little bit about the types of things we are seeing, the types of telemetry and attacks we're seeing, which largely fall into those four buckets. And what types of things are we considering in terms of mitigations, more so from a business standpoint, and not necessarily from an academic standpoint, right? So, and it'll be interesting to understand, in my opinion, does screening actually help? There isn't enough precedence in terms of data or research to actually show that screening actually helps. Yes, it creates a process step. Yes, it creates maybe some um, false confidence in the fact that you've screened the person, but somehow people seem to get around screening. Um, then there is identity verification. We went through this elaborate process of, if you are going to get a computer from our company, then you need to show up in person and you need to do this and that and the other thing. But they subcontracted work to two people in India. How did that happen? Right? And then, so while we are looking at some of these mitigations for inappropriate use and stolen identity, essentially, um, I'm not sure it is sufficient, because it feels like whack-a-mole. It feels like, you solve for a couple of things, and then it's you get something else, and then you solve for that, and you get something else, and you solve for that. And I think there's opportunity for us to collectively work together to have a proper framework of looking at these things across all of the various dimensions, which I think will be more helpful than doing whack-a-mole. So when you look at credentials on the dark web, which was really our second pillar there, we're an insurance company, a health advisor company, an investment manager. So, we've got clients, we've got advisors. Advisors come and take your money, and clients willingly part with it. So, we've got info stealers, you got various malware variants, you got sticky notes, and then you've got advisors that will say, let's say you got 10 people that are their customers, and they will go in and say, I'll manage your accounts. Let's make um, your, uh, your token delivery mechanism, SMS, all to my phone. And people will happily do that willingly and sign a piece of paper as well that says, we delegate the operation of my investment account to my investment advisor, and therefore they have access to the MFA token, not them. So then you ask yourself the question, you can't solve stupid, but there's a lot of education to be done, and a large portion of our population, believe it or not, requires that education, so they come up from a social perspective. So tomorrow, if we had an AI advisor or we had something like that, they're not even going to know what hit them, because they're not sort of socially aware with respect to where technology is and where they're getting services from and what that means to them and so on. So this notion of client awareness is a big thing for us, because you can't just go and drop a digital service if they don't know how to properly use it and safely use it. And I think that applies to a lot of things in the world, and especially things that are enabled by AI. I met this software vendor the other day, and they said, today um, you have, five pieces of functionality that you buy from us, but we have improved our software so much that there are 20 pieces of functionality now. It's going to cost you $1 million a year more. And I said, what if I don't want those pieces of functionality, the other 15? You can't buy the software without it. To me, that's a whole different kind of ransomware. Yeah, I think AI and impersonation is an area where we can have a lot of academic collaboration. We're doing some research with the Irish Development Authority and a couple of schools in Ireland, just to, supporting a few PhD students, just working on, can you give us some traits we can look at in terms of video impersonation, in terms of audio impersonation, and most importantly, things that are inbound within teams and collaboration platforms, because that's how we work. So it's really important for us to get a view with respect to some of those things, and education. We've got the Canadian Cyber Center, we've got the Cyber Threat Exchange, and I'm the chair of that organization. We've got the Canadian Anti-Scam Alliance, we've got the NC3, we've got a lot of resources, and I think it's important for us to sort of come together to be able to do that. And I also think it's important for these folks to come together to be able to um, sponsor areas of research that are going to be useful for all of them collectively. Then I think we're going to get a significant lift. Otherwise, we're just going to piecemeal all of these things, and it's just going to yield in a couple of papers.